Okay, welcome to this clip where we're going to start looking at Amazon GuardDuty. Now, AWS defines GuardDuty as a continuous security monitoring service that analyzes and processes the following data sources. We see VPC flow logs, CloudTrail event logs, and then DNS logs. Okay, but what does GuardDuty really do? Well, the first thing is it uses machine learning to identify malicious attacks on your AWS account. Now, it does this by utilizing different threat feeds, which can contain resources like lists of bad IPs or malicious IPs, or maybe some reported abnormalities within accounts. So they're using all of this built-upon data to identify these different malicious attacks automatically. Now, it also scans for exposed credentials, privilege escalations, and malicious traffic. So basically, it's going to be able to see if any access keys, static credentials were exposed, if you've had unwanted privilege escalations to maybe admin level roles, or if you have some type of incoming malicious traffic into your AWS account. And then lastly, it's going to be able to detect compromised resources as well as unauthorized deployments. So if someone does get into your account and they compromise your resources and maybe start deploying tons and tons of unauthorized resources, just incurring an enormous amount of cost, GuardDuty is going to be able to alert on that. So let's check out GuardDuty in the console. Now, when you load up GuardDuty for the first time, you get brought to this Getting Started page. Now, this is a pretty familiar page for most of us. And it just has the Getting Started guide, the different steps that go along with it, and then we have documentation and support here at the bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Getting Started, and you can see we're greeted with a welcome screen. Now the first thing it's going to do is warn us about the service permissions needed. So we are granting GuardDuty permission to analyze our CloudTrail logs, our VPC flow logs, and our DNS query logs to generate these findings, which is kind of what we discussed in that first slide. An important note here is that we can suspend or disable GuardDuty at any time to stop it from processing. And underneath that, you can see when we enable GuardDuty for the first time, your account is automatically enrolled in a 30-day free trial. And I can tell you from experience that GuardDuty can get pretty expensive if you're using it in all of your different regions. It adds up pretty quickly, but it is a great tool to use. So before we enable this, we can actually view the service role permissions that are going to be needed. You can see the permissions here, and then we also have our trust relationship, which is saying that, hey, GuardDuty is allowed to assume this role. So I don't see anything funky in the permissions. It looks like it can basically just describe our images and instances. So I'm going to close this out, and let's go ahead and enable this. Now we can see we're brought to our GuardDuty dashboard. So we're in our free trial mode here, as it's noted. And if I click on this, you're going to see, hey, we have basically 29 more days of our free trial here. And then eventually, after this gets going a little bit more, they're going to be able to provide us an estimated cost after our trial ends. So you're not going to see this updated in this clip, but if you enable this on your account, you will see this after a few days. We can also see here that we can have different accounts underneath this. So this is handy for if you have organizations where you're having a ton of different sub-accounts. You can have one master account that has all of your different member accounts underneath it in one location. So you basically send out an invite to these sub-accounts and they accept it in order to be added to your account screen here. The next thing we see here is lists right above that. And this is where you can essentially whitelist certain items. So the first thing we see here is trusted IPs. So it's going to essentially ignore any IPs that you add here in your trusted IP list, and it's not going to report on any of those findings. The next thing underneath that is the threat list. Now, the threat list is going to essentially allow you to add a known malicious IP address to a list so that GuardDuty can immediately generate findings on it. It's not going to have to take a little bit of time and generate some type of threat model based on some machine learning because you can specify it immediately. So it kind of helps GuardDuty out and speed the process up. The next thing we see here is our settings. So if we go to that, we can see our About GuardDuty section. We can see our permissions, which is the service role that we gave earlier. The next thing we see is our CloudWatch events, so we can automatically send notifications to CloudWatch events here, and then we can set up our frequency that we want. So new findings are going to be updated immediately, you can see here, and they put a caveat of, hey, that's really within 5 minutes. And then any updated findings we can specify. So we can set it to a default of every 6 hours, or we can set these 1 hour or maybe every 15 minutes. And then the next thing we see is our sample findings. So this is where we can generate sample findings to help us visualize and analyze the different types of findings that are produced by GuardDuty. So it just kind of helps us out. So let's just go and click this button here, and we can see that, hey, it successfully generated sample findings. So we'll go over that in a minute, but let me continue on this page. And we can see we can suspend GuardDuty. So when you suspend it, it stops your monitoring and doesn't generate new findings. Now, a key part of this is that you're not going to be charged when the service is suspended. So if you want to take a break from it, you can just suspend it and you're not going to be billed for that. The next thing we can do is disable it. So if you want to disable it completely, you can do this as well. And obviously AWS will not bill you if you disable it. Now, the big difference between these two is that when you suspend it, your existing findings are going to stay there. You don't have to reconfigure your settings and rediscover your findings. But when you disable GuardDuty, you're going to lose everything. You don't recover anything if you decide to re-enable it. And you can see they say here you can save, or you should save, a copy of existing findings. So with that understood, let's actually look at these findings here. And you can see that these are the generated ones that we had, because we obviously don't really have any traffic on this account. But you can see how they classify everything. So these are sample events that are found via GuardDuty. You can see it looks like we have a Tor IP caller. And when you hover over it, you see the message and the reason why. And you can see it pretty much scans for a lot of stuff. A Tor relay, our CloudTrail logging was disabled by a user. And then you can even see we have a Trojan here, and it was on our particular instance here of I, and then repeating nines. So it gets very detailed, and it can actually scan pretty deeply into our resources within our account. So let me go and click on one of these. And then you can see when I do that and I select it, it's going to populate our screen over here on the right. We can see our unique finding ID, and then it gives us a reason or a status of what's going on. We can see that this instance is attempting to query domain names that resemble exfiltrated data. So this could be an indication of a compromised instance. They classify as a high severity. It gives us the amount of times it was hit, the region, the resource, and then the resource affected underneath that, which shows the resource role as an actor, the instance state, what image it is, the different AZs, what type of instance, and really just all types of very detailed information that we can use to isolate and maybe fix or just completely remove this particular resource. So this is a very, very powerful tool that a lot of organizations use when they need to enable some type of overall compliance monitoring from a centralized standpoint. So I do recommend you go ahead and check GuardDuty out, especially if you're in an enterprise account, and play around with it to see what works best for you. That's going to do it for this clip. We're going to wrap it up, and then we'll wrap up the section overall in the next clip with an IAM best practices review.